The bullet was already in the air before anyone on the ground knew a shot had been fired. That is the part that people struggle to understand, not the distance, not the physics, the silence, the complete unannounced silence that preceded the most precise confirmed long-range shot in recorded military history. No warning, no radio call, no heads-up to the Kurdish fighters crouched 2 miles downrange, just a trigger pulled by a man whose name the world would never officially know, and a 50 caliber round moving at supersonic speed through a July sky above northern Iraq. The year was 2017. The city of Mosul had been a war zone for nearly 9 months. Iraqi forces, Kurdish Peshmerga fighters, and coalition advisors were locked in the final and most brutal phase of retaking the city from the Islamic State. Every street had been contested. Every building was a possible ambush. The fighters of the Islamic State had turned the old city into a maze of booby traps, fortified positions, and sniper nests of their own. Civilians were still trapped inside. Supply lines were stretched thin. The heat was relentless and the dust was everywhere, coating everything, getting into lungs and weapons and eyes. The coalition had people embedded everywhere, advisors who were not supposed to be fighting but were close enough to the front line that the distinction had become mostly theoretical. Among them, operating under layers of classification that made their presence in Iraq something the Canadian government would later struggle to explain in plain language, were members of Joint Task Force 2, Canada's most secretive special operations unit. Men who did not appear in press releases, did not give interviews, and did not exist in any public record connected to ground combat in Iraq. One of them had set up on a ridge. He had a Macmillan TAC-50 rifle, a weapon chambered for the 50 BMG cartridge, a round originally designed for anti-material use, capable of tearing through light armored vehicles and engine blocks at distances that made conventional sniping look like target practice at a fairground. The TAC-50 is a heavy weapon. Bolt action, 5-round magazine. It is not fast. It is not elegant in the way that word gets applied to firearms in films. It is precise in the way a surgical instrument is precise, cold, deliberate, and built for one specific purpose. The sniper, a man whose name was later reported by sources close to the investigation as belonging to the JTF-2 regiment but was never formally released, had been tracking an Islamic State fighter who was operating in open ground, not a random target. A specific individual who had been coordinating movement through a corridor that had cost Allied forces dearly over the previous 72 hours. 11 soldiers had been lost or wounded in that stretch of ground. The corridor was functioning as a kind of artery for the other side, feeding fighters and information into positions that were making the entire advance slower and more costly. The decision to engage had gone up the chain. It had come back down. The shot was authorized. What was not communicated, or was not communicated in time, or was communicated and failed to travel through the fractured and overloaded radio network connecting the various units in that sector, was that the shot was coming at all. The spotter lying beside the sniper was working the rangefinder and calling wind adjustments in a low, steady voice. The distance to the target was measured and verified, 3,540 meters, just over 2 miles, 2.2 miles to be exact. A number that, when it surfaced publicly in the weeks and months that followed, would be greeted with open disbelief by people who understood ballistics and open disbelief by people who did not, for entirely different reasons. At that range, a bullet does not travel in a straight line. Nothing does, but the deviation at that distance becomes significant enough that the shooter must account for factors that a person firing at a conventional combat distance would never consider. The curvature of the Earth matters, not enormously, but it matters. The Coriolis effect, the slight deflection caused by the planet's rotation, must be calculated and compensated for. Wind must be read not just at the shooter's position, but estimated along the entire path of the bullet, through air that the shooter cannot see or feel, over terrain that creates its own local weather patterns. Elevation changes affect air density. Temperature affects powder burn rate and therefore muzzle velocity. Every variable compounds. The spotter called the final figures. The sniper adjusted. He controlled his breathing. In training, snipers are taught to fire between heartbeats in that fraction of a second when the body is most still. At this distance, the concept applies, but it is almost philosophical. The shot requires a stillness that goes beyond physical. The mind has to go somewhere very quiet. He fired, and the sound of the shot, a heavy and authoritative crack, moved outward from the ridge in all directions, but sound travels at roughly 340 meters per second. The bullet was already moving at approximately 900 meters per second when it left the barrel. By the time the sound of the shot reached anyone nearby, the bullet was already more than halfway to its target. 10 seconds, that is approximately how long the bullet was in flight. 10 seconds is a strange amount of time. It is long enough to notice, long enough to count, long enough to change your mind if you were the one who had fired, though there was no changing anything by then. The round arced upward, reached its apex somewhere in the sky above the valley floor, and began its descent. It found its target. The Islamic State fighter dropped. The corridor went quiet. The coordinated movement that had been funneling fighters through that stretch of ground stopped because the man managing it was no longer standing. For approximately 30 seconds, nothing happened. Then everything happened at once. The Peshmerga fighters in the area heard the impact before they understood it. There had been no shot called over the radio. There had been no notification that a coalition asset was engaged in that sector. The sound of the impact, the visible effect on the target, registered first as confusion and then as alarm. Had there been a secondary Islamic State sniper? Had a drone fired without warning? Had someone from another unit made an unauthorized engagement? 3 separate radio channels lit up simultaneously. The questions flying through those channels were not calm. Units that had been carefully coordinating their positions suddenly had no idea what had just happened. Was the area still hot? Was there a threat they had not identified? Were they themselves in the crosshairs of something they could not see? A coalition liaison officer, a man named Gary Elliott, who had been embedded with the Kurdish command for 4 months and who would later describe the following 45 minutes as the most chaotic of his career, began working the radio to try to establish what had happened. He got conflicting information from 3 directions. He got silence from a 4th. He got a partial transmission from a 5th that cut out mid-sentence. Gary Elliott was good at his job. He had been in difficult situations before. But what made this one different was that the answer to the question everyone was asking, which was simply who fired that shot and why was there no coordination, was locked behind a classification wall that most of the people in that radio network did not have clearance to breach. The sniper was there, his shot was real, his authorization was real, but his existence, in the formal sense that would allow him to be referenced over an open or semi-open radio channel in a multinational combat environment, was not something that could be confirmed by the people who needed to confirm it. This is the mechanism at the center of covert operations that rarely gets examined clearly in public discussions about special forces. The operational security that makes units like JTF-2 effective also makes them invisible in exactly the moments when their visibility would prevent chaos. The shot that ended a threat and potentially saved lives simultaneously fractured the coordination of the Allied units whose lives it had been intended to protect. The Islamic State fighters in adjacent positions heard the confusion over captured or monitored frequencies. They did not know what had happened either, but they recognized the sound of disorganization when they heard it, and they used the window it created to reposition. The window lasted less than an hour. Gary Elliott eventually got confirmation, through a chain of calls that went higher than anyone in the field had expected, that the shot was friendly, authorized, and successful. The units settled, the advance resumed. But the question of who, exactly, had fired that shot did not go away. It traveled back through the debrief chain, up through intelligence assessments, into the kind of quiet but pointed conversations that happen between senior officers when something has gone right in the operational sense and sideways in the coordination sense. Someone had made a decision, or a series of decisions, that had resulted in a historic precision engagement being conducted without adequate notification to the units it most directly affected. The bullet had found its target. The fallout was just beginning to find its own. In Ottawa, no one was talking yet. The Canadian government's official position on the involvement of Special Operations Forces in direct combat roles in Iraq was carefully worded, perpetually qualified, and essentially designed to acknowledge as little as possible while remaining technically truthful. Canadian Special Forces were in Iraq as advisors and trainers. That was the position. The position had been under pressure for months as reports filtered back through journalists and military observers that the line between advising and participating had become, in the dust and urgency of Mosul, largely invisible. The shot, when it became impossible to contain within classified channels, was going to make that position much harder to hold. But that reckoning was still days away. On the ridge in the fading heat of a July afternoon, the sniper broke down his position. He and his spotter moved with practiced efficiency, leaving no trace of where they had been. The rifle went into its case. The case went with them. They moved off the ridge through a route they had already memorized and cleared. The valley below was quiet again. 2 miles away, the corridor that had taken 11 Allied soldiers was open. No one on the ground knew who to thank, and no one in the classified chain of command was in any hurry to tell them. The morning after the shot, the number had not yet surfaced publicly. It was moving through channels, being verified, being measured again, being submitted to the kind of forensic ballistic reconstruction that would eventually make it impossible to dispute. But the soldiers on the ground in Mosul did not know they had witnessed history. They knew only that something had happened that they could not explain, that it had caused 30 minutes of dangerous confusion, and that whoever had fired had apparently not considered it necessary to inform anyone. Gary Elliott wrote a report. It was careful in its language and pointed in its conclusions. He had spent enough time in multinational coalition environments to understand that the friction between national special operations mandates and shared operational awareness was not a new problem. But the scale of what had occurred, the sheer distance of the shot, the complete absence of coordination, and the downstream chaos that had followed, made this incident unusual enough to warrant detailed documentation. His report went up. It did not come back down in any form he recognized. The Canadian unit involved had its own reporting chain, and that chain ran parallel to and largely separate from the coalition structure in which Gary Elliott operated. This was standard. This was, in fact, the design. JTF-2 did not answer to coalition command in the same way that regular embedded forces did. Their authorization came from a different level, their accountability flowed through different channels, and their operational details were protected by classification categories that most officers in theater simply did not have the access to see. This meant that the most consequential military event in that sector on that day was being processed by two parallel systems that were not fully communicating with each other. The Islamic State, for its part, had lost a significant coordinator. The effect on their operations in the corridor was immediate and measurable. Movement slowed. Communication between positions in that sector became more cautious. The fighters who had been using that stretch of open ground as a transit point began moving at different times, in smaller groups, using cover more carefully. The psychological effect of understanding that something had reached out from an invisible position at an unimaginable distance and taken one of their own was not a small thing. Fear is a tactical asset. At 3,540 meters, the fear it generates is of a particular kind. It is not the fear of the explosion, the drone, the close-range firefight. It is the fear of a precision that feels almost inhuman, of being watched from somewhere you cannot see and being found and being engaged and never hearing the shot that decided it. That fear changes behavior. Changed behavior costs time and coordination and effectiveness. The corridor, which had been a wound in the Allied advance for 3 days, began to close. Meanwhile, in a classified facility, a ballistics team was doing its work. The verification of a record distance shot requires more than the word of the shooter and spotter. It requires the reconstruction of the event using independent data, terrain surveys, weather records from multiple stations, calculations of atmospheric pressure at altitude, wind data where available, the physical evidence at the point of impact, the position of the shooter established through whatever means were available. The team working this reconstruction was methodical. They were not under pressure to produce a particular result. Their job was accuracy, and the number they kept arriving at from multiple independent approaches was the same. 3,540 meters. The previous confirmed record had been set in 2009 in Afghanistan's Helmand province. A British soldier, a corporal named Craig Harrison, had engaged 2 Taliban fighters with a L-115A3 sniper rifle at a distance of 2,475 meters. That record had stood for 8 years. It had seemed to many in the military community who understood the physics involved like something that would stand for considerably longer. The new number was more than 1,000 meters beyond it. To give that gap some context, 1,000 meters is the length of 10 standard football fields placed end to end. The additional distance over Harrison's record was itself longer than many shots that would be considered extraordinary in any other context. The team completed their work and submitted their findings. The finding was clear. The finding was, by any standard of measurement, extraordinary. It sat in a classified file while the Canadian government figured out what to do with it. The problem was not the shot. The problem was the context in which the shot had been fired. Canadian Special Operations Forces were in Iraq under a mandate that the government had defined in public as non-combat. Advisors, trainers, people who stood behind the Peshmerga fighters and provided guidance and expertise without participating directly in the fighting. The shot was the most direct possible form of participation. a member of parliament named Owen Griffiths, who sat on the Defense Committee and had been asking uncomfortable questions about the scope of Canadian Special Forces activities in Iraq for several months, learned of the existence of the record before the government made any public statement. He had a source. He always had a source. He did not reveal the source then and has not revealed it since, but the information he received was accurate, and he began asking questions in committee that the defense minister had not prepared answers for. The defense minister, a composed and experienced politician named Patrick Sheridan, was caught in a position that was structurally impossible to navigate cleanly. He could not deny the shot. The evidence was real, verified, and known to enough people that denial would not hold. He could not celebrate it without acknowledging that a Canadian soldier had been engaged in direct combat in a theater where the government's official position was that Canadian soldiers were not engaged in direct combat. He could not explain the coordination failure to the coalition partners who were quietly asking about it without revealing details of JTF-2's operational parameters that were themselves classified. He chose the only path available to him, which was confirmation without elaboration. At a press conference in Ottawa, flanked by military advisors who stared at a point somewhere above the assembled journalists, Patrick Sheridan confirmed that a member of the Canadian Special Operations Forces had engaged a target in Iraq at a distance that represented a new record for a confirmed long-range shot. He confirmed that the engagement had been authorized. He confirmed that no Canadian soldier had been harmed. He declined to name the soldier. He declined to specify the unit. He declined to elaborate on the nature of the authorization or the operational context in which the shot had been taken. He took 7 questions. He answered in any meaningful sense none of them. The journalists in that room were experienced. They understood what they were watching. A government managing disclosure with the precision of a man diffusing something complicated in a confined space, every word chosen to reveal the minimum required to forestall the maximum damage. The story ran everywhere the next morning, and the number 3,540 meters escaped the classified file and entered the public consciousness, where it has lived ever since. The forums were first, military and firearms communities online, where people understood what the number meant in terms of physics and equipment and skill, erupted in a debate that was partly technical and partly simply stunned. The calculations were run by people who knew how to run them. The atmospheric modeling was reconstructed by enthusiasts with access to weather data archives. The bullet trajectory was modeled in software used for ballistic analysis and posted online within hours of the story breaking. The consensus after the technical community had done its work was that the shot was real, not because the Canadian government said so, but because the numbers worked out, because the ballistics were consistent, because the physics, stretched to their limits but not beyond them, supported the conclusion. But alongside the technical validation came the human question that the government's careful non-answer had left wide open. Who was he? In the modern information environment, the anonymity of a person connected to a public event of this magnitude is both easier and harder to protect than it once was. Easier because governments have become more sophisticated about managing classified identities in the digital age. Harder because the network of people who touch any significant military operation is large and networks leak. The soldier's name did not emerge from official channels. It did not emerge from JTF-2. But it began to circulate quietly and without confirmation through the community of people who had been in theater during that period, people who knew or thought they knew or had heard from someone who knew. A journalist named Caroline Webb, who covered defense and security for a national publication and had spent years building relationships inside the military community, began following the thread. She was careful. She was not looking to expose a classified identity in a way that would create risk. She was looking to understand the story behind the number, because the number without the person was only half a story, and she had spent enough time around soldiers to understand that the person was always the more important half. Caroline Webb made calls, she waited, she made more calls, she sat with people who would not speak on the record but who would, over time, speak. She built a picture not of a name but of a career. Of a man who had entered the Canadian Forces in his early 20s, moved through the selection process for special operations with the kind of quiet determination that instructors remember but do not talk about publicly, and had spent years in the invisible part of the military doing the kind of work that never appears in annual reports or commemorative ceremonies. The picture that emerged was of someone who was, by all accounts, extraordinarily good at a very specific and demanding thing, and who appeared, by every indication available, to have no interest whatsoever in the attention that thing had generated. This was, in the community Caroline Webb was interviewing, considered entirely consistent with the profile. The people who are best at what this soldier did are, almost universally, people who do not want to be known for it. The requirement of the work is invisibility, patience, and the ability to function without acknowledgement. The people drawn to that kind of work and who succeed in it tend to be people for whom public recognition is not a motivating factor. This is not modesty in the conventional sense, it is something more structural. The job selects for a particular psychology, and that psychology is not compatible with the appetite for visibility that public recognition requires. This made Caroline Webb's work harder and, in a certain light, more interesting. She was not chasing a man who wanted to be found. She was trying to understand a man who had done something that the world was now paying close attention to, and who had, as far as she could determine, already moved on. The military had moved on too, in its operational sense. The advance in Mosul continued. The corridor that had been a problem was no longer a problem. The Islamic State's grip on the city was tightening in the way that a fist tightens when it has already lost, not releasing but unable to hold. The battle was not over, but its conclusion, by July 2017, was no longer in serious doubt. The city would fall. It was a matter of time and cost. The cost was still being paid in the streets. The sniper, by the time his shot became public knowledge, was no longer in the position where he had fired it. Whether he was still in Iraq, whether he had rotated out, whether he was in a training facility or a briefing room or a house somewhere in Canada eating breakfast and watching the coverage with the particular detachment of someone watching news about a country they visited once, was not known. Not publicly, not then, possibly not ever. The record stood, the name did not. And in the gap between those two facts, the real story had taken up residence, patient and unresolved, waiting for a question that the official record had decided not to answer. The battle for Mosul ended in the last days of July 2017. It had lasted 9 months. It had been the largest urban combat operation since Fallujah in 2004. The human cost was staggering, measured in soldiers lost and wounded on the coalition and Peshmerga side, and in civilians who had survived the occupation only to be caught in the final grinding weeks of its removal. The physical city was in many of its oldest districts largely destroyed. The liberation was real. The damage was also real. Both things were true and neither canceled the other. In the aftermath, the accounting began. Not just the military accounting, the territory retaken, the fighters removed from the field, the infrastructure recaptured, but the human accounting. The investigation into how the operation had been conducted. The review of decisions made and coordination failures that had occurred. The documentation of what had worked and what had not. The shot surfaced in this accounting in multiple ways. From a tactical perspective, it had worked. The threat had been eliminated. The corridor had been disrupted. The advance had benefited. These conclusions were clear and not seriously contested by anyone who had access to the full operational picture. From a coordination perspective, the picture was more complicated. The investigation that Gary Elliott's report had initiated was not the only one. Coalition partners had raised questions through their own channels. The specific concern was not the shot itself but the absence of notification. In a multinational operation of the complexity of Mosul, the ability of a single national asset to engage without informing adjacent allied units was a risk. The risk had not materialized in this case into something catastrophic, but the confusion it had generated was documented, and the potential for a different outcome in different circumstances was taken seriously. The internal reviews produced recommendations. Some of those recommendations involved communication protocols between special operations units and coalition command structures. The details of those recommendations were classified. Whether they were implemented and how effectively was not publicly disclosed. Owen Griffiths, the member of Parliament who had been asking uncomfortable questions before the public confirmation, had more questions afterward. He asked them in committee. Some were answered in open session. Many were answered in closed session, and what was said in closed session stayed there. He emerged from those sessions with the measured expression of someone who had received answers that were technically complete and substantively unsatisfying. He made public statements that were careful, pointed, and productive of further questions without producing further answers. This is the characteristic shape of democratic oversight of classified military operations. The questions are asked. The answers arrive in forms that confirm the general shape of events without illuminating their specific contents. The public record contains the outline. The interior remains dark. Caroline Webb published her story. It ran at significant length in a major national outlet. It contained no classified information. It contained no name. What it contained was the fullest publicly available account of the circumstances surrounding the shot, the operational context in which it had occurred, the coordination failure that had followed, the political reaction in Ottawa, and the nature of the man, drawn from the accounts of people who had served with him or trained with him or crossed paths with him in the particular world that JTF2 inhabits. The story was read widely. It was cited by international outlets. It was referenced in military analysis pieces and in the broader conversation about the role of special operations forces in modern coalition warfare. The soldier it described was still not named. Caroline Webb received messages after the story ran, some from people in the military community who thought she had gotten it right, some from people who thought she had gotten it wrong in specific ways they were not willing to specify, some from members of the public who wanted to know the name she had not included, as if withholding it had been an oversight rather than a choice. She had made the choice deliberately, and she stood by it. The question of whether public interest in knowing the identity of the most precise long-range shooter in military history outweighed the security and personal risks of publishing that identity was not, in her assessment, a close question. It was not close. The record, in the meantime, had acquired a life of its own. The ballistic community online had moved from initial debate to something approaching settled consensus. The shot was real. The distance was real. The technical requirements for achieving it, the weapon, the ammunition, the environmental conditions, the skill of the shooter and spotter working as a unit, were understood and documented and discussed with the level of detailed enthusiasm that specialist communities bring to their specific obsessions. A man named Peter Halloway, who ran a popular podcast on long-range precision shooting, and who had been covering competitive and military shooting for 11 years, dedicated 3 consecutive episodes to the shot. He brought in ballistics experts, former military snipers, meteorologists who specialized in applied atmospheric modeling, and a retired JTF-2 officer who spoke only under the condition that nothing he said would be directly attributed. The episodes were among the most listened to in the podcast's history. Peter Halloway was careful to distinguish between what was confirmed, what was strongly supported by available evidence, and what was speculation. He was also honest about what the record meant in the context of human achievement, and he was thoughtful about the moral weight of discussing precision engagement as a technical accomplishment while acknowledging that the target of that precision had been a person. This tension between the undeniable technical extraordinariness of what had occurred and the human reality of what it was ran through every serious public discussion of the shot. It was easier to avoid the tension by focusing entirely on the physics, and many discussions did. It was harder and more honest to hold both things at once. The soldier who had fired the shot had presumably held both things at once before pulling the trigger. The authorization had been granted. The threat was real. The decision had been made. But the act itself, the act of ending a life at a distance of 2 miles with a single deliberate action, is not an act that disappears into pure mechanics regardless of the justification. The justification stands. The act also stands. Both are permanent. Peter Halloway talked about this in his 3rd episode, and the conversation he had with his retired JTF-2 guest on that subject was the part of the 3-episode series that got shared most widely, even by people who had no particular interest in the ballistics. The guest, speaking in the measured tones of someone who had thought about these questions for a long time, said something that was widely quoted afterward. He said that the people who are best at what this soldier did are precisely the people who understand most clearly what it costs, and that this understanding is not a burden that sits on top of the skill. It is woven into it. The clarity about what you're doing and what it means is part of what allows you to do it without hesitation when it is necessary and without regret when it was right. He said this, and then he said he was not speaking about this specific soldier because he did not know this specific soldier's inner experience, and no one should presume to. The conversation stayed with the people who heard it. Somewhere in a location that remains unspecified, the soldier who had fired the shot was living his life. He had a name, he had people who knew him. He had presumably an opinion about the public conversation that had grown around the act he had performed. Whether that opinion was one of indifference, discomfort, professional satisfaction, or something more complicated and harder to name is not known. The record is the most public thing about him. Everything else is private, and by every available indication, he intends to keep it that way. By the time the dust of the public debate had settled, roughly 8 months after the story broke, the conversation about the shot had split into two very different streams. One was technical, one was political. They ran parallel, rarely intersecting, each producing its own conclusions without much reference to the other. The technical stream had largely reached its endpoint. The record was verified, the methodology was understood. The feat was catalogued in the annals of military history alongside other moments of extraordinary individual skill, measured and documented and permanent. The shooting community had processed it, debated it, and absorbed it into the accumulated knowledge of what a human being with the right equipment and the right training can accomplish under the right conditions. The political stream had not reached its endpoint and showed no signs of doing so. The question of what Canadian Special Operations Forces were doing in Iraq, and under what authority, and with what level of parliamentary awareness and oversight, was not a question that one extraordinary shot had created. It was a question that had been building for years, through multiple deployments, through changing mission mandates, through the accumulation of incidents and reports that suggested the public framing of Canada's role in Iraq and the operational reality on the ground were describing two different things. The shot had made it impossible to avoid the question for another news cycle. That was its political significance. Not that it revealed anything that had not been suspected, but that it made the gap between official description and operational reality too large and too specific to be covered by the usual language of measured acknowledgement. A parliamentary review was initiated. It was not the first. It would not be the last. The review produced a report. The report contained findings and recommendations. The findings confirmed that the operational mandate had been stretched beyond its publicly stated boundaries. The recommendations addressed training, authorization protocols, and communication with parliamentary oversight bodies. Whether the recommendations were acted upon, and to what degree and with what consistency, moved into the quiet interior of institutional process where such things typically spend the rest of their lives. Owen Griffiths, who had spent 2 years pressing for clearer answers, read the report and called it a partial step in the right direction. His language was the language of a man who had learned to measure progress in small increments because large increments were not on offer. Patrick Sheridan, the defense minister, called the report thorough and welcomed its contribution to the ongoing refinement of Canada's special operations framework. His language was the language of a man who had navigated something difficult and had made it to the other side without losing anything essential, which is a form of success in politics even when it does not look like one. The journalists who had covered the story moved on to other stories. This is not a criticism. It is the nature of the work. The story had run its course in the news cycle. The questions that remained unanswered were the kind that do not resolve into headlines. They resolve slowly into policy, or they do not resolve at all. Caroline Webb moved on to a different investigation. Peter Halloway moved on to his next 100 episodes. Gary Elliott completed his rotation and came home and went back to the kind of work that does not make the news. The soldier whose name had never appeared in the public record continued doing whatever he was doing. The city of Mosul continued the long, complicated, painful process of being rebuilt. The people who had lived through the occupation and the battle to end it continued the harder process of rebuilding themselves. The human reality of what that city had experienced was not something that a record-breaking shot, or the political debate it generated, or the technical community's fascination with the physics had much to say about. Those were separate conversations happening in separate rooms. In the room where the shot had been fired from, on the ridge above the valley, there was nothing. The position had been broken down and cleared with the thoroughness that JTF-2 personnel trained for. The ground showed nothing. The ridge showed nothing. If you walked out to that position today and stood where the sniper had been, you would see the valley stretching away from you toward a horizon you could barely define. You would see, if conditions were right, approximately 2 miles of terrain. Somewhere out there, at the far end of what your eye could barely grasp, was the point where the bullet had arrived. You would not be able to see it, not from here. The distance is too great for human eyes without equipment. This is the thing about 3,540 meters. It is beyond the range of the unaided human senses in any meaningful way. The shooter cannot see the target with the naked eye. The sound of the shot does not arrive at the target until after the bullet already has. The connection between the act and its consequence exists in physics and in intention and in the calculated intermediate space of the scope, the ballistics tables, the atmospheric data, the spotter's voice, and the stillness at the moment of trigger pull. It is the most mediated form of human action imaginable, and also, in the moment it resolves, the most absolute. The record stands at 3,540 meters. The name of the man who set it does not appear in any public document connected to the event. And the question that became the headline, the question that people asked in the confusion and the aftermath and the months of political debate and technical analysis, the question that gave the shot its public shape, remains, in the most literal sense, unanswered. A shot was fired. Someone fired it. That is all they will ever officially tell you. Everything else that is known exists in the space between what a government confirms and what it chooses not to say, which is, in this case, the space where the most interesting truths have always lived. The bullet found its mark. The story has not found its end. It may not find one. Some things are designed to stay open, not by accident and not by failure, by design. Because the alternative, the full account, the name, the face, the words the man himself might offer if anyone were allowed to ask him, lives in a part of the record that has been closed. Not forever, possibly not forever. But for now, and for now is where we are.